Maurice, I think I'll hand it over to you. Oh, are you okay?
Yeah, yes, no, I'm brilliant. Although to be honest, I thought you were opening.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. I am. So, hi everyone. My name is Fizza Qureshi. I am the CEO of the Migrants Rights Network. I just kind of want to share a bit of insight as to why I thought it would be useful for us to bring this event together. And I don't think if anyone hasn't been reading the news, then maybe what I'm going to tell you is something new. But if you've been following the news here in the UK and Europe, you'll probably be quite familiar with why we think this is an important issue in terms of really trying to understand refugee policy and how it is being influenced by race and racism, and also religion and what we would say is religious discrimination, largely Islamophobia. I basically I'm in the migrant refugee sector in the UK, and what we do tend to have is a slight shying away of really bringing race and migration together. Maya's nodding and great, because I'm sure she's going to bring that to her talk, and really trying to see through that racialized lens as to why certain people are welcome and who isn't, who is let in, who is refused. And I think the Ukraine conflict in itself was like a positive moment for us to really see how people, when they are fleeing persecution and want safety, doors will open quite easily. New policies can be created, however poorly enacted they are, especially in the UK. But there is a way you can make change happen, and you can open your doors. But what was really clear was who was being welcomed in and who the doors were being opened for. And that was, some of you will have seen the videos, and Halima's going to speak to a lot of what they've found in their report around Black and brown individuals who were also caught up in the conflict, either Ukraine, people who are now Ukrainian or international students, how they were not welcomed as refugees at the borders. And it's bringing up a conversation that I think we need to have. So this is a start of a conversation around this issue of how race and religion all influence Europe's and the UK's policies. But what I am going to do now is going to hand over to Maurice to introduce himself, and then he'll introduce the speakers, and then you can hear from the speakers themselves.
Hey, thanks very much. So my name is Maurice Mcleod. I'm the Chief Exec of Race on the Agenda, and we're an anti-racism change driver. We're sort of pushing for to break down systemic racism wherever it occurs, which is pretty much everywhere. So our work is cut out. I was really interested when Fizza came to me and said, let's do something about this joint issue, because the conversations about migration have gone on for a while, and I think it's really easy, certainly in the mainstream, to de-racialize it, and it's sort of the issue is presented as if race isn't important, and then when it just happens that the people that we're sending out happen to come from those places. But that Ukraine, I think, was a real eye-opener. It was a real, oh wow, actually the public and even the government can act in a different way. It is possible to act with compassion, and that then, I'm hoping we can use that spotlight and go, okay, great. So if this is now the standard, let's progress with that kind of working. But as we know, and as I'm sure some of the speakers will go on to talk about, there's a flood of legislation coming out that's already come out, that's come into law, that's gonna impact on our communities. And just as the government's sort of saying, yes, we're going to be kind and welcoming to Ukrainians, they're talking about shipping other refugees to Rwanda. So, we're in a really, I think, quite pivotal and precarious place. And a lot of the gains and a lot of, we already had problems. And I fear that those problems are going to be exacerbated because we have a government maybe sees a need to play to a certain racist element. anyway, I'm just really glad to be in this space, and I think it's really important. I think this is the beginning of conversations across migration and race, which sometimes, strangely, those sectors don't work as closely together as they probably should. But enough from me, to be honest. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Halima Salat Barre, who, and forgive me if I mispronounced your surname, by the way, Halima. She's an investigative journalist at the Lighthouse Report. She works across a number of Dutch organisations, but she's worked everywhere from Kenya to the Netherlands, and in English, Swahili, and in Somali, and has been reporting on the stuff that we were just talking about, the plight of the 70,000 students in Ukraine, many of them Black and Asian, and we all saw the way that they were treated compared to everybody else. Anyway, no further ado, I hand you over to Halima.
Oh, thank you so much for such a nice introduction, actually. I don't know how to pronounce your name properly. Fizza. Okay. Thank you so much, you guys, for inviting me, because I'm going to talk majorly from an observer perspective, because that's what journalists do anyway. Not necessarily from like I have an opinion perspective. I hope that's okay with everyone. I mean, there's a couple of questions that initially just come to mind, like, you know, when we first, we all saw the exodus of the refugees from Ukraine, but the first days of the flight, these videos were being shared across social media. And Lighthouse reports, we focus a lot of our investigations on open source first. So we did, you know, we were observing a lot of the social media activities, and what we noticed and that piqued our interest were these videos were being shared majorly, were showing African, Indian people who were scrambling for evacuation trains. So so, you know, naturally we started looking at the videos and we started verifying them. We started geolocating the material, checking the authenticity of the posters, and most importantly, we were trying to find the missing context. So that needed that we trace these people and we talk to them. And the issue of hierarchies at the borders, in queues in accessing help, was something that kept recurring in the testimonies we're getting from people. So that is like the first entry we had. Like there's some sort of a hierarchy where the Ukrainian refugees who were also leaving Ukraine and the students who were also leaving Ukraine, they were accessing help in a differently. If that's like where I would like to start. But I don't know if you guys want to do this like where you ask me several questions, or I could just keep talking like a broken record. How would you like to do it?
No, I mean, you're certainly not a broken record. It's, you know, you were there seeing some of the stuff that we were seeing reported. So if you have more to say on that, fine, or I can open it up to questions from inside. I mean, were you on the ground? Were you actually on the border yourself, or?
Not myself, but two of my colleagues actually did go to the Polish border in two different areas of the Polish border crossings. And our stories also then started getting more information and more reports, and so it became like a huge investigation in terms of like the bigger picture. And so my colleagues went and they heard that there were students that were in detention after crossing the border from Ukraine. There were students in Ukraine, and so they've crossed over to Poland and they have been detained. So we naturally, the curiosity of like, why were they detained? What is the story? What's happening? So, but we also have, you have to understand, we work in a collaborative manner. So we do have other, we call them media partners, who are on the ground as well in various different places across the borders and inside Ukraine. So we used all this, how do you call it, all this information together to create the report. Yeah.
And so the impact of the report, though, do you think that, because I know certainly when I first saw that, you know, everyone was watching Ukraine, and sure, and then we saw pictures of I think it was African students I saw originally, and I think there was quite a lot of skepticism, certainly in the I heard mainstream commentators going, oh gosh, why are people making this a race thing? There's nothing to do with that. It felt like it needed the reporting that was coming out to confirm that. Do you think that actually changed how those students were treated, or did the treatment carry on being as appalling as it was?
Look, our reporting even is still to date continuing in a widely shared Twitter thread, where we keep on adding whatever new information and whatever new publications that we've done, whether with media partners or on our own. But what you have to, sometimes you kind of have to stop censoring yourself. If you say, oh, we're not going to look at this because it's got nothing to do with it. Facts are facts, and reporting and investigation is always about facts and finding what those facts are. Now, initially, I would say media were kind of like mentioning it, but not like the context and giving it much attention. So I do believe that this was it needed not to look at it like you've made up your mind this is race, but to investigate if this is what this is about. Yeah. And you could yeah, I mean, and we're not saying that we didn't witness other a large number of students who crossed without problems, who didn't face any discrimination. We're just saying that the numbers were significant enough to look at, if that makes any sense or answers your question in any way.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, you say it's about important to notice the context. I mean, the context is that we have racist borders all over Europe. Europe, you know, you could argue the project of Europe has I'm trying not to be too dramatic, but has a racist exclusionary thing in its heart. So if you're talking about hey, we're opening the doors for lovely Europeans to protect them, it's almost no wonder that people who don't look like that, who don't tick those boxes, face something more serious. To your understanding, though, where are these students now? Are most people are people still in detention? And if so, how many? And what's being done to support them? Are their countries helping them? What's actually going on now? Do you know?
So we are staying with the we've published the bigger chunk of the investigation with media partners, as you've all read, but we are staying with the follow-ups. In this case, you would still hear new instances of there's a case there where this person used to live in Ukraine. They had maybe a temporary stay in Ukraine, and they've crossed over to either Poland, Hungary, Romania, the external borders of the European Union. And these reports we're still looking at them, and it almost feels like there's not going to be an end, where it's almost now become like a steady stream of new reports, new cases, that sort of thing. Of course, we, in the initial days of the publication, you'd see like a bit of change of, not even change, I would say, a bit of like relaxation. You see, especially on the Polish border side. I could talking about that because that's where majority of our cases were coming from.
Yeah. But was there a, I imagine, was there a history of racism basically on those borders? I'm certain if Ukraine bordered the UK and this was happening, I'm sure that there'd be issues with Black students coming into the UK. Is there a known history of racism on those borders anyway?
You have to understand the various contexts, especially firstly from the EU's external borders. What would we call the EU's external borders? These external borders, I mean, Poland has long played this role of keeping unwanted refugees outside the EU, Poland, Croatia. These countries have the various reports, including some reports that have been done by Lighthouse reports that recently won some awards. So it's always these stories are there, and they have we know it's almost not news that the external borders do have some sort of like a gatekeeping role.
Yeah. So then, do you think? And maybe this is being too optimistic then, do you think that the spotlight, people know that this has happened, there is an awareness that this happened on those borders, do you think that will in any way change what does happen on those borders? Is it more, I've heard some politicians in those parts of the world actually being quite proud of their racism and thinking that they're, doing their best to defend, their people. Do you think that there'll be any shift or any movement in light of the reports, and the fact that we know that this has happened?
I mean, one way to interpret this sometimes is like, well, I mean, migration has been such a subject in majority of European countries, in all of Europe, and the fact that now you see the overwhelming response for Ukrainian refugees, and it's absolutely needed. I feel like I have to emphasize that it's absolutely needed. Everyone who's fleeing conflict has the right to seek safety, of course, but it's almost a bit ironical. I would say the conclusion you can make is that, oh, okay, so when it's when it's not people coming from elsewhere in the world, then things are, there's compassion and there's, personally, I like the equality of compassion. Like, this is a personal opinion, not as a journalist, obviously. Like it needs, compassion needs to have an all round for all human beings, not necessarily those who look like us, I guess. Does that answer your question?
No, absolutely. I've got a question here from Halima, actually. Sorry, not a question for your Halima. I've got a question in the chat from Fizza. Your reporting clearly struck a nerve with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who dismissed the allegations of discrimination. Quotes, Ukraine border guards denied allegations of discrimination, insisting they are under enormous pressure, and Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson says they apply a first come, first serve approach. What impact do you feel you're having? What impact do you feel your reporting has had, and has it helped to impact any positive changes for Black and brown people at the border?
I mean, it's always very difficult to measure impact in terms of like, okay, so we've done this report, and I almost feel like as a journalist, you'll always say like, mine is to investigate, report, eliminate, and let those responsible take action. And we have had interactions with the various from the handles that were representing the Polish government, handles or people who were supporting, or were calling us that we are, what was the word, Kremlin propaganda. because this report basically was showing that, you know, there were also incidents where some of these students were being, there was violence towards them on the Ukrainian side of the border. So that all of those things are in our report. And so impact is something that, as a journalist, you will feel proud of the work you've done. But you're always hoping that, you know, once you've told the truth can have some form of, I don't know, for humanity, people to find their humanity in themselves, for, you know, policymakers to look at mistakes that have been made and something like that. And to, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, as you know, activists or whatever, you can't change what you can't see. So half the battle we often find is even proving the thing that we know to be true. So the reports in themselves or you know, are incredibly valuable. My background is sort of journalism, and it's for that reason. It's for, you know, you can't, until you can expose stuff, you can't really do anything about it. So yeah,
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm very grateful for what you guys have been doing. I want to open it up. I know it's been very two-sided, and this is I want to be more interactive. If anyone has any particular questions they'd like to ask, please make yourself known. And I'm looking around pretending that I'm going to be technologically adept enough to work this out, but I have the brilliant Safer behind the scenes helping.
People put their hands up, then we can come to them and unmute you, etc., and then you can ask the question yourself as well. If not, we've got plenty of questions that we can put to Halima as well around the work they've done.
Everybody's shy, or everybody's in that Monday zone, I think. Fair enough. Well, I mean, thank you. Unless you have any questions, Fizza, in particular that you'd like to ask.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to see, to know actually from you. I know you do other work and research on migration, and not just you know, beyond what you've been doing with Ukrainian refugees and the conflict. I was wondering also whether you have seen any kind of trajectory around the religious discrimination. So obviously Islamophobia is increasing because there's that association of Muslim refugees and terrorism, and whether that's influenced some of the pushbacks at the borders, for example, especially between Poland and Belarus, or whether you've noticed any other kind of like influence to policies. Yeah, and then I've got plenty of questions for you, so but I don't want it to be again two-sided, me and you interacting.
I'm presuming that is a question for me as well, right? Well, I mean, I'm actually, I was here to talk about like the issue of the students. So, but if I should speak generally, I would say, I mean, it's hard not to notice the number of people who experience these problems at the Belarusian Polish border tend to have that demographic. Now, is any specific way that we have looked at this, whether religion is a factor? No. I think not looked at it, like zoom in on that. But yeah, of course, people who come from different backgrounds and different cultures will to some extent do experience different reactions and different you know, pushbacks, as you'd call them. Yeah, so if that answers. And I'm sorry if this sounds like I hadn't prepared anything, because I haven't actually recently worked on any story that was touching on that, so the only thing I can speak about is on a general sense.
Yeah, that's it. I think it is about the general sense, because I think we all have, unless, like you said, you do that big research piece, it's very difficult to kind of confirm, but you the sense we get is that yes, there's an inclination towards certain forms of discrimination to certain backgrounds and groups, but it's you know, again, so you can't say 100% it's happening, but you know it's there. I had one more question, and then you know, if that's okay, Maurice, unless someone else would like to ask Halima a question. I really want to know, like, you talked about the newfound compassion for white Ukrainians, refugees, and just again generally your sense of how, whether you think that this is really going to influence and move Europe to reflect on its racism and how it treats refugees of colour, or do you think this is just one of those, another moment where they're going to be patting themselves on the back saying we did well with protecting this lot, and we don't need to do anything else, you know, we've done our bit? If we just get, yeah.
I think you pretty much actually answered that question. But you know, and a great example that just came to mind is there's a story that my colleague, our director at Lighthouse, Daniel Houghton, and editor Maud Julian, they did this story when they visited there at the Polish border about these two humanitarian people on the Polish and Hungarian borders. Both of them had like mirror profiles in terms of how vested they were in helping refugees. But one was helping, she had opened her house to Ukrainian refugees, and so she was like very much, you know, she was receiving a lot of Ukrainian refugees. Now the other one, it lives a couple of, you know, a few kilometers on the Belarusian side, and was you know, the reaction to the two of them was completely different in terms of, and it's such a great story. I think you should read it. It's on the Independent. If I can quickly find it, I'll post the link in the description. It's such it basically showed how one is being lauded as a hero and the other one as a villain, because the one was helping the guys who were stuck between Belarus and Poland, and you know, like and you know, that's apparently against the law. And the other one was helping the Ukrainian refugees, so the hero, a national hero, and you know, so it almost shows the stark difference in that treatment.
Thank you, Halima. There's a question from George Holder. I'll unmute you if you want to ask that, George. Oh, sorry.
Oh, hi, Maurice. Can you hear me now?
I can.
Hi there. I'm driving. That's why you haven't got me on thing. But I'm in a long queue. That's the only reason I've asked the question now. I was just sort of curious. Obviously, there's lots of different parties involved. There's how it's presented in the media, the differences, how it's presented by government, how different, you know, how the public is, you know, responding differently to Ukrainians than they might do Yemenis, etc. I guess my question was, to what extent do you think it's more a question of apathy to certain parts of the world, and what extent do you think it's an explicit sense of we don't want X here, in terms of the depictions by these different players? Yeah, I don't know if that is as clear a question as it is in my mind, but yeah, I can pass it back if it is.
Yeah, it is quite a clear question. I mean, the issue of apathy does play, and the indifference, it does play a big role, obviously. But you sometimes you almost notice that certain people will be associated, whether that's coming from a stereotypical point of view, will be associated with things that are bad and harmful and not welcome, and certain people will be associated with things that are civilized. Like, I mean, the media itself has called some refugees certain names, and some refugees certain other names. So you tend, I can say it's a mix. It's a mix of both. It's not necessarily one or the other.
I think it might be worth. I'm interested. There's an assumption that the public aren't very supportive of some people and are very supportive of others. But sometimes when you actually look at the evidence of that, I know that there were lots of people that, for instance, did want to take in people from Afghanistan when stuff was going on there, but weren't able to, in the same way that the government sort of, even about the Ukrainians making this big, "Ooh, aren't we wonderful?" But they're not actually making it that easy, you know, not removing the need for visas, for instance. They're not actually making it that easy. So sometimes I think that we can conflate what the government's attitudes with the public. So I'm sure that, you know, I'm not being naive. I'm sure there is a wave of anti-black and brown people sentiment that goes through the public. I'm sure that exists, and it's what some of the politicians play to. Remember the Nigel Farage posters for Brexit. You know, if you want to show something scary, you show a load of brown men coming towards you. That is the reason that those messages are used, is because they must cut through in some way. But I'm always a bit careful about assuming that the government's attitude is a reflection of all the public. Anyway, I know that lots of people do want to help refugees from all over the place and just aren't able to. Halima, thank you. If no one else has any more questions, I'm gonna thank you, Halima, and move on to our next speaker. I'll have a quick look around. No, thank you. That was really interesting. Really appreciate your time. If you can hang on, we'll come back on for the panel at the end, and we'll
okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so we now move on to someone I know really well, actually. Absolutely. In this field, when you're talking about race and migration, to my mind, she's for ages been one of the country's experts, and she's just also a really nice person. She's author of Hostile Environment: How Immigrants Became Scapegoats, which was published in 2020 and was longlisted for a Jallet Prize. And I'll hand you over to Dr. Maya Goodfellow.
Oh, thank you so much for that. And thank you so much to both of you and everyone else who's like working behind the scenes to put on an event like this. I agree, it's so important, and actually in so many ways it doesn't make sense that these sort of two sectors are not together. So it's really like so promising to see two such like excellent organizations working together on this. So I'm really like looking forward to seeing what else you're doing, or what you're going to be doing. So I'm going to talk a tiny bit about, I suppose, like some of the ways we might understand this differential treatment that Halima's been talking about. And thank you so much for that, Halima. I think you like sort of set the scene and like explain what's going on in a way that like it can be quite hard to follow for a lot of us who aren't doing the work that you're doing. So like really important context, I think. But I want to think about race and like the roots of like, where did this come from? Because we don't really arrive at these moments overnight, right? But I also want to talk a bit about towards the end about thinking about labeling. So how different people are labeled as part of different groups, and perhaps why we should broaden this out to think beyond asylum and beyond refugees. But I am going to spend the first bit thinking specifically about asylum and people seeking refuge. So today, these things, it sort of felt like fate in a way. I was walking through King's Cross, which is not something I do all the time, and I like walked past like really near to where the Eurostar exit is, walked past a small little room that you could quite easily ignore or not see, and saw a sign that says, "This is the welcome room for Ukrainian refugees." And inside I didn't loiter around because you don't do that kind of thing in train stations for fear of what will happen. But I like sort of peeked in and saw a Ukrainian flag, and there's some staff standing around who I assume were on hand to sort of help people if they were coming from the Eurostar or wherever else. And all I could think was that on the one hand, it was so heartening to see that, because it's just not a regular sight, right? It's not a regular sight that you would see a welcome room for people who are seeking asylum in Britain. That's just not something that that I've ever encountered. I've only ever seen hostile things like immigration enforcement bans and whatnot. And although we know the flaws in how people who are coming from Ukraine are being treated, problems with the government schemes. Like, I'm not suggesting this is all like a perfect system. The other thing, all that I could think was, this is exactly how everyone should be treated, right? This is the standard that there should be for everyone, no matter where you come from, no matter your reason for moving. And if you contrast that with the sort of language and now policies around people crossing the channel, people who are called illegal immigrants, even though under the Refugee Convention, it doesn't matter how you cross the border, because most people have to cross illegally because of the way the system's set up, that shouldn't impact your claim. The contrast is so stark. They're literally sending boats out to try and deter people from coming, leaving people to drown. And then there are welcome rooms in St Pancras Station. Like, you know, if you ever needed a sort of clear example of how different people are treated differently because of who they are, then I think this is that. And I think one of the really important things to understand, or to think about, or to recognize about this most recent government policy in relation to the Rwanda policy and the channel crossings, is the government have really honed in on this idea of young men making these crossings. And this is really, really important. I think it's a very important way in to understand the sort of broader historical context that's led us to this moment. So here, obviously, you have race, gender and religion working together, this very Islamophobic narrative that actually, unfortunately, a fair chunk of what we might call mainstream white feminism has sort of been complicit with. So if you think about the response to the Cologne attacks, it's this idea that there's this racialized threat, in particular brought by men who are Muslim or assumed to be Muslim, who bring an unwanted culture, and but also undermining a kind of European culture or British culture, which is assumed to be civilized, and they will also bring with them sort of disruption to the economy as well. These are the two sort of arguments, the cultural and the economic, that work together. And this obviously has roots in British colonialism, the idea of who is a threat and who isn't. So I'm going to talk about that in a moment, but just before I do, I think it's really important to recognize, because I'm going to think specifically about from the 1980s onwards, but there is a much longer history to this kind of exclusionary policy. So despite what the narrative that Britain tells itself, many people who were fleeing Nazi Germany, many Jewish refugees, experienced all kinds of anti-Semitic exclusion when they were trying to get to places like Britain. So one of the good ways to sort of remember this, or depressing ways to remember this, is that the kinder transport, which was children being brought to Britain, it's very telling that the children were brought, but their parents were not. And so there were sort of intentional exclusionary policies on the basis of anti-Semitism that meant that some children would turned into orphans because the British state refused to bring their parents. And like a side point to this is there is actually, although we don't want to overstate it, because there is also public hostility, as Maurice has said, this isn't an inevitability. People have at different points in British history been incredibly welcoming. That's not a British value. It's not something that's intrinsic to British people. It is just like a basis of humanity that many people understand and advocate for and fight for. So none of this is an inevitability. But to sort of get to the more recent history, what we've seen from the 1980s onwards, and I think this is really important context for understanding where we are now, is across Europe, there has been increasingly strict policies that make it more difficult for people to get to Europe and Britain, but also if they do get to those countries, they make it really difficult for them to stay. So lots of safe routes of travel have been shut down, but there's also policies that expose people to destitution and basically vulnerabilize them. So you have things like the people not being allowed to work whilst they're waiting on their asylum claims, which was brought in by a new Labour government. You have things like temporary refugee status. So instead of giving people permanence, you give them like 5 years, and then their claim is reassessed with the possibility that they will then be thrown out the country, no matter what the situation, often no matter, like, regardless of the situation in the country that they've come from. And so we've seen quite a lot of that in recent years, where the British government will say, oh, that country is now safe. The country they came from 5 years ago is now safe. Like, it's fine. So there's this sort of temporariness to it, which exposes people to, like, it causes a lot of mental distress, as you would imagine. And one of the arguments for this in, like, sort of mainstream refugee studies is that these restrictive policies were introduced in large parts of Europe because the numbers of people that were coming were unprecedented and sort of unprecedented in character. So the argument is basically that because more people could travel with the rise of airfare, cheaper airfare, it made it easier for more people to come, and that made it more difficult to distinguish between people who were legitimately seeking asylum and people who were so-called economic migrants. There's this idea that because it's easier to travel, more people pretend to be seeking asylum, and that's where you sort of get all this language around the bogus asylum seeker, the genuine refugee, the sort of illegal immigrant, and that was like in Britain was really popularized by New Labour. That was like often sort of forgotten in the story that's told of New Labour. That was a big core part of their messaging around asylum and immigration, almost like immediately when they came into office. But this sort of telling that you hear in a lot of mainstream refugee studies is like far too simplistic, ignores race, basically, ignores sort of Europe and Britain's history of colonialism. And so there is a lot of work, a scholar called B.S. Chimney, who has worked on exactly this issue and essentially argued that between 1950 and 1989, the Cold War was what the sort of main international issue that so many European governments cared about. And so in this sort of mindset, people who were seeking asylum were understood to be sort of European in a sort of broader sense. So the ideal refugee or asylum seeker was someone fleeing communism, who would be usually a man, white, and like relatively young. But the important point was that they were leaving the Soviet Union, right? And that was sort of the ideal way that asylum was seen. And what the argument goes in some of the critical literature, that what happened in the 1980s onwards is that more and more people were coming from the so-called global south, and the Cold War ended. So this led to this sort of shift in who was coming. And it was often people coming from former colonies, right? So people who had ties to countries like Britain for very, very sort of clear reasons. And so one of my colleagues I'm based at Sheffield University, and one of my colleagues, Lucy Mablin, has written a book called Asylum After Empire. And she essentially argues that these new refugees who were coming were not different in terms of the legitimacy of their asylum claims under international law. They had the same, you were seeing the same things, maybe slightly more complex reasons for moving, but that's sort of the case across not just the so-called global south. But the difference was where they were coming from, so that they were coming from these former colonies. And this is when refugees really came to be classified as this major problem. So Mablin basically tracks this back to colonial narratives around race and says that asylum seekers came to be marked as different in line with this narrative that they were like alien others from so-called undeveloped, like the non-modern world, which is what we see in like loads of the discourse now. So it's not because people are different that they are treated differently, it's because these narratives create them, say that they are different and a threat and something to be sort of worried about. And that is really rooted in race. And so I find that a very convincing argument as to the backdrop to where we are now. But I guess just to sort of like wrap up the thing, as I said at the start, I also want to mention labeling, because I think this is really important and a real risk with like in a lot of the advocacy work that we see. And I understand why it is, but it's very, very focused on asylum and people who are claiming asylum, people who are refugees. And, you know, there is international law that helps those people, like sort of protects those people to a very small degree now, unfortunately. But I think, you know, I've mentioned this phrase illegal immigration, I've mentioned this phrase economic migrant. I would actually argue that like we should broaden this out and say that people, like, it's not only people seeking asylum who are treated as if they are legitimate. In fact, is those very discourses of the idea of the economic migrant being a problem that sort of paves the way for a lot of these exclusionary asylum like language and laws. And so really we don't want to end up in a sort of path where we are positioning the good asylum seeker against the sort of bad migrant, because I think this reproduces all kinds of racialized narratives around movement and who has the right to move and who doesn't. And like, you know, I've not even mentioned like thinking about class and how that plays a role in who can move around the world and who can't. And so I suppose if we're going to recognize that there's been a small shift in this moment in relation to how people who are fleeing the Russian invasion of Ukraine are being talked about, we want to broaden this out beyond not only other people who are seeking asylum, but I think we want to say that anyone should have the right to move no matter where they are from or why they are moving. And I guess trying to create a world in which everyone can move, but also everyone can stay if they want. And that should sort of be the goal. So I suppose it's a sort of a small word of caution about how we think about who has the right to move and who doesn't when we're thinking about asylum. But I think I've said enough. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Maya. That was excellent as always. I mean, a couple of things as you were speaking occurred to me then, because I was thinking about the situation in Hong Kong, and so I felt I don't know. This is without any on the ground experience or whatever. I felt that at least from the government, the mood was the language was nicer. The language was more welcoming, and that maybe was. You mentioned people that rather than people that are fleeing, British-made bombs or whatever, people fleeing some sort of communism. There seemed to be a different slant from it. And obviously, we're not talking about white people here, so that's kind of interested me in what you were saying. What are your thoughts on how Hong Kong was treated differently?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I feel like maybe you've got a better answer than me. It's not something I've read anything about and should. I mean, my sort of thinking, I guess there is sort of a historical precedent for this kind of racial ordering, I suppose. And these things are shifting, right? So I guess the thing to say is it's not always and only that certain groups are always going to be excluded. It's at different times. It is also what's politically salient, but also how. I think the difficult thing is to make sense of, which is hard. And I'm trying to do this at the moment in some of my work, is to also think about how bordering processes produce race. So it's not just that it's already a given, that these things already exist, but there are processes that at work that treat some groups as a problem and some as not. And I think maybe it is thinking about fleeing a sort of government that is seen in Britain, this sort of this all the clash of civilizations thing is sort of being transferred in this way, geopolitically. So I wonder if that plays a role. But I would also say there's another layer where I imagine people from Hong Kong, anyone who's coming to say Britain to seek refuge it's not like you're going to be insulated from racism in the everyday, especially if we think about what's happened during the pandemic. So I suppose there's sort of two ways at least of thinking about it, but I don't have a good answer, I don't think, for exactly why that, how that works in relation to race, but I think it's a really good question.
No, it's I think it was something that I think I was watching Novara Media or something, and someone Barnaby on there sort of said that you shouldn't think that Ukrainians are welcome because they're white because they're it was not they're welcome because they're white because they're welcome, which got me thinking, which kind of plays into what you just said. I can see a question from Roger there. Would you like to? I'll unmute you, Roger. Oh, unmute.
Trying. Yes, I think I've unmuted myself now.
You have, yes.
I've come to this webinar to learn because I'm confused and uncertain and I don't really understand. And I don't even know what I think myself, really. So bear with me, please. I have a horrible feeling that this kind of discrimination that we're talking about is much more widespread than is being suggested this afternoon. I mean, I think humans have always discriminated amongst people, but more particularly against people. You can go back to the centuries, to the millennia, but even in the last century, we've had the so-called parsley massacres in the West Indies, when the Dominicans were massacring Haitians. We've had the massacres in Rwanda and the Hutus and the so forth. We've got the alleged genocides going on at the moment in Burma with the Rohingyas. We've got the situation with China and the Uyghurs. We've had the Kurdistan massacres in the past. And it's not just about race, it's also, as you've been talking about, religion. I mean, think of the Holocaust and the religious problems there. I mean, not on the same degree, but as an elderly person, I have been discriminated against because of my age. Certainly, we discriminate against people of colour. We discriminate against people who are disabled. Women and men are discriminated against differently from one another. People of different kinds of social stature. And I don't know how you deal with this, really. I just have a horrible feeling that it's built into our genes, and that trying to separate it out into racism makes it more difficult to solve. I mean, I'd like to think that in Britain, certainly in my lifetime, over the last 50, 60, 70 years, I would have thought, I like to think, that the situation has changed enormously. I mean, it was perfectly frequent to see signs in the front window of a house saying no blacks. Now that is illegal, and a lot of the kind of discrimination we've talked about is illegal in this country, and so I just don't know where we're going. So I'm talking from a point of complete confusion and uncertainty. So I hope somebody can sort of help me to understand better. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. I mean, I mean, the confusion and sort of frustration you're talking about there is part of the people that do the work that certainly that ROTA does. That's a constant. How do we both explain and unpick? I mean, the area that we happen to be looking at is race, but equality doesn't mean anything unless everyone has it. So as we're looking at race, we're also looking at gender, we're also looking at religion, we're also looking at the way disabled people are treated. And you're right, we have a society that has inequality of all sorts sort of baked into it. Now, yes, that does mean it's hard and it does mean it's tricky, but that certainly doesn't mean that we can go, oh, well, it's hard. We sadly have to roll up our sleeves and do what we can. And that's what, fortunately, there is a whole sector, there is a whole infrastructure of organizations and individuals. I can see Andy Gregg in this call, who was my predecessor here. There's been a long history of fighting these battles, and sadly there will carry on being a long history. And so I take your point that it is difficult, but sadly that's the world we're in. And yes, there are loads of inequalities. This is the one that we happen to be looking at, but they all overlap anyway, I would say. Andy, I can see your hand up there. One second, let me unmute you.
Hi, and great to have this meeting of the two kind of parts of the movement, because I think it's so important to bring these two issues together. And I've often felt that actually there's two different languages and ways of speaking going on that haven't fitted together. And I think, ironically, the Ukrainian situation, which is largely white migrants or refugees, it is bringing this to a fore in a way that other issues haven't. And I think there's an irony there that has both good and bad about it. I mean, I think to reply to the previous person, I think one of the problems with the issue in this country is how bad and how little white people are prepared to talk about race in a way that is actually open and interested and interesting and capable of change, rather than just being the kind of notion that there's certain things we can't say. I think actually we don't have enough conversations about race in this country, rather than too many. And I think that's one of the issues that I think ROTA has always wanted to, I think, bring to the fore. And I'm very pleased that that this discussion has highlighted some of that. Just a quick reflection on the Ukrainian situation. I think there's a real danger of a sort of hierarchy coming out here of good refugees, white, Ukrainian, and people from Hong Kong may be kind of assimilatable into that, partly because I expect because of class, actually. And then you have bad asylum seekers, and most of whom are black and brown, and many of whom are men, of course. One of the other differences is that this whole thing is not just racialized, it's gendered as well, because of course the Ukrainian refugees are largely women and children, whereas other refugees tend to have a majority of men coming first because they try out the migrant routes and take the risks, and then bring their families later. So, and then of course the whole issue of people who are already here, who are treated, who are from a migrant background or a refugee background, who are then treated terribly badly as well. And I think all of these things need to be brought together and looked at in their entirety, rather than sort of split down into different fissile kind of bits, if you like.
Can I come in there, Maurice?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was going to say, Andy, that's exactly what at least at MRN we're trying to do. We're trying to break down that hierarchy of the different migrant groups that everyone gets kind of lumped into, and you know, as Maya's already said around the labelling, we've got this great Words Matter project, which our digital marketing assistant Anna has been creating explainers around, trying to debunk some of that language. You know, and you know, I'm glad Maya's mentioned the genuine bogus asylum seeker. That's another one we've got on our list. And the sad thing is that you've got some of the sector itself and some of the more liberal media adopting the same language, thinking that it's acceptable and it's okay to use this language because it will speak to government or will speak to a certain population that, you know, we might be persuadable. So I think we're also sometimes complicit in like amplifying certain labels, unfortunately. I was just going to give a little bit of insight, and it's a very cynical view around Hong Kongers and Ukraine in terms of the acceptability of them as refugees. I think with Ukraine, it's very much around who the country's politically against. So if you think about who the enemy is of the Ukrainians, that's why Europe and the UK is kind of more welcoming and opening their arms to them. Again, very cynical view around, you know, the politics, the geopolitics of this. I don't know, Maya mentioned it. The same with Hong Kong, right? It's thinking about who they're kind of challenging, but also alongside that, we have a labour shortage in this country. Again, really cynical view. There is something around how you fill a gap. And there are going to be ways that the government will use certain policies to just try and plug that gap without saying it's trying to plug that gap. And so that's why I think we have this visa scheme. Again, I know it's not working in the way it should be for Ukrainians. And, you know, Maya's already mentioned, you know, the kinder transport where families have been split up, and you're seeing that with Ukrainian families being split up. You know, a child hasn't got a visa to enter the UK because they don't have a passport, you know, simple things like that, where you think if you really were as compassionate as we say we are, then we wouldn't put people through this really traumatic process of while they're just languishing in a country waiting to hear whether they're going to be able to get to the UK. So and interestingly, someone mentioned it to me the other day as well, that the Refugee Convention in itself is actually offers people a temporary status. It's about a temporary measure of protection. So again, if we look at the kind of foundations of the legal statutes that are there that we use, we haven't moved on from them being temporary to more permanent. And it's about the states just going back and reenacting and using kind of language that already exists. So there is, you know, I'm glad that, Maurice, you've got this rallying call. It is about us kind of like, yeah, rolling our sleeves up and really trying to push those boundaries so that we do get a moment, as Maya said, is we are moving for the sake, because it's a choice we've made rather than we're forced to move or because we have to. So I really do hope we can get to that point in our lifetimes.
Yeah, I know we're going to go to a sort of more open panel discussion, but there's a question in the chat from Stuart Leach. Stuart, I can read it out, or it might be easier if I actually, can I find you? Yeah, if I unmute you, will you, do you want to read the question yourself?
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, I was just intrigued about the discussion about Ukrainian refugees being kind of considered better or more worthy than refugees from African countries or elsewhere, and it's just looking back, I mean, I'm a photographer and I'm doing a project. I live in East Kent, so I'm actually doing some work about the coastline, its relationship to this issue. And I was just intrigued looking back at all the press there was about, you know, when Romania joined the EU and, you know, that kind of Eastern European bloc of countries that joined, and the rhetoric there was around that in kind of 2005. I remember like Tony Blair did a big speech in Dover, you know, after those policies, and it's just kind of like, it seems like the hierarchy just shifts. The narrative's always the same, but we just shift it to different people depending on who we can target at a certain point. And it does seem very kind of, I don't know, two-faced to the British public, really, to basically have voted for Brexit on the basis that they were scared of Turkish people joining the EU. Also, you know, a lot of xenophobia about Polish people, Romanians, you know, and, you know, you hear it all the time. As, you know, my partner's family who live in Kent will, you know, bang on about Polish people. And, you know, and now it's Ukrainians, because we can see, you know, because Putin is so evil, we can see that there's kind of, you know, a set of people coming from that who are the same, but it just seems very kind of, yeah, conflicted to me that's now a narrative. So I was just wondering if anyone, you know, what you thought about that.
Yeah, that feels like a question for Maya. It does suggest that, like I was saying, that there's a flexibility to whiteness, but that feels like a Maya question.
No, yeah, I mean, I guess like a few things. Like, firstly, just say, like as Fizza said, like in none of this am I trying to suggest, or would I think that like people who are sort of fleeing from Ukraine are like actually being treated well by the British government. Like, our welcome room was actually empty this morning. I mean, I don't know what that tells us, but, and also, even if people are welcomed, like that can be very temporary. And so like, it will be, you know, we should all sort of keep an eye on how people are treated in the longer run, because that also matters in this. People like being made destitute, like I said before. So I really just want to stress that I'm like, in no way am I trying to suggest people are being treated like well or in the way that they should be. There's always, with the government architecture, like major problems in how people are being treated. But I think it's a really good question, and there is like work on that, on like exactly about how the sort of narratives around people from Eastern Europe, like particularly in the new Labour years, like you say. And I think it sort of relates to the point that Roger was making around like, I guess, confusion with some of this, and like really it being difficult to pin this stuff down. And I suppose like the sort of cop-out answer, or like what I think is the what I do believe, but it sounds like a cop-out, is that you do have to examine these very particular moments to look at what is happening. Because to make generalizations, yes, we might be able to sort of see trends and see like how race and other sort of like gender might be shifting, but these moments do tell us a lot to look at the specificity of what race is doing. And the thing here is that like, it's not, you know, we talk about race as this sort of static thing because that's what that sort of colonial hierarchy told us to do, but race is created. And so people can be racialized in different ways and in different moments. And if you look at some of the, like in my book, I became very obsessed with the new Labour years because I just find it infuriating. But if you look at like the discourse that you mentioned, Stuart, and I'm sure you know this, is that there was like, this is sort of tying together people from Eastern Europe with crime and with these sort of culturally threatening ways of being. There's a whole story in the Mail or something about people from a certain Eastern European country, I can't remember where, like killing the queen's swans or something and eating them, which is inaccurate, but like was really based in this idea of like this innate difference. And I suppose when we think about like race, one of the sort of one of the markers now is yes, things have like changed in important ways, as Roger said, but it's like culture becomes this sort of term for racializing. So like we talk about cultural difference as if it's innate, as if there is a British culture or a European culture, and like racialized others are going to threaten that. And so that's why it can be people who might be, you would say on the street, might be white, but actually they're being racialized in that particular moment as not quite white or as a sort of cultural threat. And that's the sort of trickiness of it. And just like one thing I want to say, because I always love using this quote, is like when you're talking about culture, it is constructed, it is not static, it's not like a real tangible thing. And there's a really nice quote from the cultural theorist Stuart Hall, which is like, what does anyone know about a British person except they can't get through the day without a cup of tea? Where are the tea plantations in England? Like, the tea plantations are in India, they're in Sri Lanka. That is the outside history that is inside the history of the English. And I think that quite nicely shows us that this is sort of constructed. And I guess the point maybe where I would like slightly disagree with what Roger was saying is that I don't think it's inevitable that we will have these differences. I think they're created, and I think we can change them and challenge them and sort of work against them. And it's very necessary that we do. Sorry, that was I don't know if I quite answered Stuart's question, but that's like the things that came to mind when you were, but I think it's good. I think more work is probably being done on that.
Thank you, Maya. Fizza, I don't know if we should, I know there are two hands up. I'm also looking at the time. Can those questions be asked as part of the general open?
I actually think, no, that's great. I mean, I know that kind of Anna had a response actually to Stuart's question. So if it's George, if it's okay, I'm just going to go to Anna first, and then I'll come to George. I'll just unmute you, Anna.
Hi. So I just wanted to read out what I wrote in the chat. So the whole, so obviously, like, historically there has been kind of hostility and like negative sentiments towards Eastern Europeans, and I find that really interesting because it's like you're seeing Orientalism being deployed against white people, because Eastern Europeans, a lot of them will be white, and usually Orientalism is deployed at a much more pernicious scale against like Asian people, whether, you know, like Middle Eastern, South Asian, East Asian people. So I guess it's just interesting to see that being deployed historically, and then now with Ukrainians, the way they're being treated is like they're not being orientalized. And I think the people that are being orientalized is Russian people, because again, it comes down to the geopolitical nature of the conflict and the kind of the history of the Cold War, and sort of that kind of comes to define, I guess, who is orientalized and who isn't. And if like being orientalized kind of ties into the way you're viewed as like barbaric or viewed as a threat and that kind of stuff. So I think it is like deciding who is a threat and who isn't a threat is like it's loads of different things together. It's like Orientalism, it's like geopolitical interest, and as Maya was saying, it's like it's a thing that can change like with the moment, depending on like bigger powers or bigger agendas. So yeah, that was just my like thought process.
Brilliant, thank you, Anna. Yeah, I was gonna, you made a really good point about in terms of Russia. I mean, we've been speaking to some individuals who are of a Russian speaking or Russian background, and they're appalled at obviously what's happening in the name of their country. They can't speak out because of potential repercussions to either themselves if they go back to Russia, or to their family and friends. And we forget that actually there are Russians who want to be refugees because they want to flee that oppressive regime as well, or that situation. And we don't have routes for safety for them either. So they're also stuck. And so I'm glad you kind of brought that up, Anna. And I'm just going to move on to George. I'll unmute you, George, so you can ask your question.
I'm just about to talk on this.
We can hear you, George. Oh, sorry, I've unmuted you already.
Oh, sorry, there, I've just come on. So I was just saying hello to my. Sorry, bear with me a sec. The question I had was just regarding the new nationality and borders.
Oh, have we lost George? You were going to ask a very kind of current, you know, hopefully we'll get George back and he can ask his question up. Oh, are you back there?
I think I'm back. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Sorry about that. I was just getting back into the house and I think it was just switching my Wi-Fi to my thing. Sorry, it was just around the new Nationalities and Borders Act that's just come through. In light of all the kind of conversations we've had, and in terms of certain people coming from certain parts of the world being less likely to have any other routes, how do you think it might change the face of, you know, no pun intended, but of, you know, refugees coming to this country and asylum seekers coming to this country in the future? You know, what do you think we can expect? And then secondly, it's a more kind of Well, no, I'll just keep it at that. The second question's not really to do with racism. It's more to do with it just seems incredibly problematic for so many reasons, doesn't it? Yeah. Anyway, so I'll leave the second part to it.
Great. Halima, I don't know if you've been following the UK's recent immigration.
Oh, the one about Rwanda, everybody's followed it, right? Like,
yeah, that's
it was actually, it was quite. I mean, it's sad that you actually have to laugh about something like that, because I do have friends who are originally from Rwanda, second generation British now, who, like, we were just having this discussion. It's like, doesn't the British government know the history of why Rwanda? You know, so it's like, it's quite a bit of a, yeah. You guys are in a sticky, I guess. I mean, the rest of Europe isn't like.
No, is it Denmark?
Wonderful as well, but.
I was going to say, isn't it Denmark is trying to follow suit, but around?
I mean, yeah. I mean, this I wouldn't use the word trend, because then it becomes like a trivializing it. But these trends tend to kind of circle back always. It's just a matter of which country's done something first.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Maya, did you want to comment on George's point?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and it's kind of hard to predict. I think that there will be lots of legal challenges to what the government are trying to do. But I think the point is, if anyone is sort of percent, that this is a major problem, right? And the evidence that there is, because there's like been some stuff like this done before, is that what happens is people just try to make the journey again. And so, like, what we know, right, is that people have no other choice, and so they will. Like, it just shows us that border policies are the things that expose people to violence and harm, and the reason that people die crossing the channel is because of the government's border policy. Really, that is the core part of the issue, and successive governments have talked about people smugglers, and actually the only reason they exist is because of the government's border policy, and that will just continue to be the case. It just will. There's not much else that can be said other than it's, yeah. Maurice, go on.
Yeah, I mean, the Rwanda policy, I think, I mean, like everyone, it came as a, not as a shock, but as a, what, they're really going to do that? I don't think it's an actual policy. I know they might try and send some people there. I think it's much more about the message it sends to some of their base. It's much more, they could have picked any country in Africa that has a name that sounds African. It's more about, we're not letting these people, flood into Britain. And I don't think they have any real intention of actually using it for many people. I think, as you say, Maya, there'll be so many legal challenges, and it's such a ridiculous system that's flawed in so many ways. The cost of it is ridiculous. All sorts of things about it are ridiculous. Not even going on to the cruelty of it, but it's so ridiculous. Maybe I'm being naive again. I can't see them actually getting to do it much. I think it's much more about going, yeah, that's what we did it's much more about that dog whistle or foghorn. It's much more about being really loud about their racism, I think.
Yeah, I was going to add also, if you think about where we are now, so the language that they're using, which is tackling illegal immigration, is the language that has been set up by Theresa May. We're talking about 10 years of banding on about the same thing, which isn't an issue. There is no issue around illegal immigration because no one can be illegal, full stop. But you've got this really good common strategy behind this all, which is just, we're going to be, consistent with our message. And so every single immigration policy that's been brought in since then has been about tackling so-and-so illegal immigration. And this is what they think they're going to implement to tackle this. I think you're absolutely right. I think this is a distraction technique. this was a very clever, let's bring this in. We've got really bad politics issues going on over here with our party politics. And therefore, this is a way we can distract the public and also, like you said, play to their base, which is, we are going to do this. We're going to be really harsh. And look how, and again, scapegoating the migrants and the refugees as always, because they're easy kind of targets. I know George has got another question. One question I did have was to basically Halima and Maya, was really around this, again, focusing on Rwanda, but this kind of attention on outsourcing everything. So we outsource our detention centres. We are now outsourcing our refugee responsibilities in the UK if the Rwanda plan goes ahead, which hopefully won't. And just like you said, the trend is there, but we do seem to be looking at what others are doing across Europe and then replicating it. We even saw it with, we've got Napier Barracks here. It's a former army barracks being turned into an asylum reception and detention centre. And then you had an army base turned in Ukraine, turned into a detention centre, or you've had them in Poland. It would be really interesting to just get your views on kind of like, how are we, at a point where we can, rather than, hone in and say and critique those, we're saying, well, great, you've done that, we're going to copy it and do it over here as well.
I mean, it almost feels like there's a circle, and then the external borders are doing all the really bad shit, and then but the European and personally, I'm speaking as a person who wasn't even born in Europe. The European Union tends to have these, of course, there's shared legislations in this kind of issues to do with migration and all that, but you tend to see this. I mean, I'm not even sure. Like, it's like the outsourcing has been there, I think, in various different countries, in various in variations, I guess. But what was I going to say? What was I going to say was, it almost feels like there's an unwritten agreement that we're gonna do our best. If you can do some bits and you can do some bits to keep everybody out, so let's, an unwritten agreement. So of course some countries are doing a little bit better than others when it comes to looking at fundamental human rights of people who are either fleeing conflict or the border policies. But I don't know. I'm becoming a bit pessimistic as the times go. I think it's getting worse and worse. So I don't know. I hope that answers the question in any way, or I don't know if I'm all over the place with this one.
No, I think it's really difficult to answer anything. To comprehend how and why we are where we are at the moment.
Yeah.
I'll see Maya, please chip in.
Yeah, I mean, just very quickly, no, I mean, I agree. I think there's sort of like two things. Is like there's been an increasing move over the past like two decades of EU policy of externalization, and what you find is like there can be, as I think there is with the Rwanda, like, anyone correct me if I'm wrong, is this is also like related to like aid policies, and so there's this sort of push towards giving countries money to like shore up their borders and stop people from moving in the first place, which sort of sounds, as part of that sounds like it might be okay, but actually there's an interesting relation there between like the kinds of development policies that are then implemented and how that impacts people within countries, like the kinds of sort of capitalism, I guess. And that the reason that my answer there is vague is I'm working on exactly this at the moment and thinking about outsourcing. So I'll have a better answer for you in like a year. But I think there's something about how not only does the state, like, does capital sort of benefit from people coming in and being paid like really badly and then like being chucked out the country at will when they're no longer useful, but there's also money made from the border, right? And so I don't know exactly what is going on there. I think it's more complicated than just saying there is money made from the border, because there's a tension there, right? The CBI want people to come in and work, and like border companies want to be able to do the bordering. And so there's an interesting sort of tension there that I think the government or the state is trying to manage, but exactly why that is and how that functions, I don't think we know, because I just think there's not enough work done on that so far. So I think it's a really good question, but I don't know.
So watch this space as Maya will come out with a book or some research around outsourcing. We look forward to that. We did have this will be the last question, and obviously we'll bring it to a close because we did say it's till 7:30. So George had a follow-up question which he's put in the chat. So it's around the deprivation of citizenship. So again, Halima, just for context, in the UK we can deprive people of citizenship, and we have a clause was added in the recent Nationality and Borders Act around deprivation of citizenship without notice. So people can go abroad, get to the border and find out actually they're not allowed back into the country because they're not deemed to be British anymore. So the question is around how far do you feel these might be expected to be put into effect? Extremism in particular seeming both more nebulous, and imagine certain time of extremism less likely to have rights stripped. I'm not sure I think it's probably paraphrased, but essentially how much do you think that deprivation of citizenship might actually be implemented without especially without notice?
I mean, just quickly, as it's already happened, like as you say, Fizza, it's like the clause here, the shift, which is a bad one, is to an already existing bad piece of like legislation, or like part within legislation, which is like that now it can be done without notice, which is a bad move. But we already have seen this, like with Shamima Begum, and so the reason, because there's so little time left, like the reason that it impacts people who are like minoritized, people who are Black, Asian, minority ethnic, is because of the way that citizenship law and immigration law is structured. So it means that if there's any sort, if you have the possibility of being able to claim citizenship in another country, then that's what this is all related to. It's sort of quite complicated, but also quite simple in that's why it impacts people, certain groups and not others.
And largely Muslims, because it's about the anti-terror aspect. So I think deprivation of citizenship was used quite a lot in the past around fraudulent kind of documents. You acquired your citizenship fraudulently, etc., or crime, and now it's being used much further and used around certain groups and communities. But I feel like we've left on a really down note, which I guess is difficult, because what are the positives around what we've discussed tonight, apart from maybe we're all here to discuss it and learn, and have spent part of our evening actually hearing from Halima and Maya. So I really want to thank you both for joining us tonight and sharing your perspectives in terms of your research in Ukraine, and then obviously Maya's perspectives on where are we heading in the UK, who knows. Thank you again, Maurice, as well for chairing the first part, and everyone who's kind of got involved and spoken, and who will also share what we've heard and learned tonight. Do want to, as I said right at the beginning, we do want this to be a beginning of a discussion. We're really glad that people have joined us to kind of think about how race, religion, and not just refugee, it is migration policies intersect and are intertwined, and how they're influenced. So I think, please watch this space. We will probably just drop a line to everyone after the event just to see how else you can get involved. We've got newsletters, both ROTA and MRN. Please join those again, where we will have more explainers in terms of debunking some of the language, further events, etc. So just want to thank you all for joining us tonight. Really appreciate you taking your time out, and like I said, do get involved and let us know how we can further this discussion in this space. And I'll leave it to Maurice if you've got anything to say as well.
Oh, literally, I was just typing thanks all, and then thanks both to Maya and Halima and everyone else that's given time to this. Yeah, as has been said, both ROTA and Migrants' Rights Network have newsletters. I hope we'll be doing more work in this area together. So you know, keep in touch with us, and we'll keep you informed about that. But again, thank you.
And virtual round of applause for everyone. Great. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Cheers, Maya. Bye-bye. Cheers, Halima.